All right. Well, it is noon, and let me say good afternoon to those of you in the Eastern time zone. I guess where you are, it's still good morning.
Good morning.
And happy Earth Day. Welcome to BioLogos' very first Instagram live event. I really hope this works. My name is Jim Stump. I'm the vice president at BioLogos, and I host our podcast, The Language of God. BioLogos is a Christian nonprofit organization dedicated to showing the church and the world the harmony between the findings of science and authentic Christian faith. I'm very pleased to be joined here by Rick Lindroth, a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Department of Entomology. That's right. Insects, right?
That's correct, yes.
So Rick is an expert in ecology, has also been an advisor and speaker for BioLogos. So in just a bit, we'll get talking about all that and Earth Day for 30 minutes or so, and then we'll take some questions from you who are listening. You can type those in the comments, and we have people pulling those out and getting them to me. But first, it's hard to start any conversations these days without asking how you and your loved ones are weathering the pandemic.
We're weathering it, I think, about as well as anybody can be. We love our kids, but fortunately they're not home. So yeah, it's just my wife, Nancy, and me. We're getting out for walks on a regular basis and hunkered down. I'm as busy now as I was before the pandemic with, as I'm sure you know, webinars and online meetings. But we're missing people. And even someone who's not by nature really gregarious, I'm missing people. So, yeah, we're not right.
And I would guess the work of an ecologist is fairly difficult to do from home, isn't it?
It is. And right now we're trying to figure out how to get some of my graduate students and postdocs to be able to even work in the field alone in the summer. So we've got some plans in process. But my goal is just sitting and writing papers anyway.
Right. Well, why don't you tell us a bit more about your work? What are the kinds of things you do that you're trained in and study and write papers about and all that?
Sure. So I'm an ecologist, and for the listeners who aren't really familiar with the field of ecology, sometimes it's confused with environmental science or environmentalism. Ecologists basically study the interactions of organisms with other organisms and organisms with their environment. So we study connections, we study interactions. Think about the difference between a zoo and the natural world. The difference is interaction. So zoos would be a lot more fun if we just turned all the animals loose, right? So those are the interactions that make. Wendell Berry once said that changing water into wine was actually a small miracle, and that the greater and ongoing miracle is changing water and soil and sunlight into grapes. Mm-hmm. So I like to say that we do research on miracles. We study how do plants take air and water and sunlight and minerals from the soil and make thousands upon thousands of different chemical compounds. And then what we do is we study how those compounds mediate or influence ecological interactions. So plants produce both good things and bad things. They produce the caffeine in your coffee, which is really there to defend them from being eaten by insects and other things. And we study how that chemistry influences the ecology of plants, including how it's affected by climate change and high levels of CO2 and other pollutants.
So what specific organisms are you working on in particular?
We do most of our work with trees, and my favorite tree species is aspen. It's the most widely distributed tree species in North America. People who live in the northern states or out west would be very familiar with aspen. And we study various things that feed on aspen, from insects to elk to beaver, and how the chemistry of the plants and how climate change influences those types of interactions.
Nice. Are you discovering anything surprising or what our audience might find interesting about those aspens and the organisms on them?
We've found that under high levels of carbon dioxide, which we're anticipating for the next 50 to 100 years, that plants grow faster because CO2 is like a plant food. So plant growth is going to help draw down CO2 that we put in the atmosphere. But we've also found that insects that feed on plants that are grown under high CO2 eat more. They do so because the levels of proteins in those plants are diluted out. They're not as concentrated, so they eat more to make up for that. And what my group has shown is that sometimes that feeding by insects can more than compensate for that elevated growth because of CO2. So that's something that modelers and others need to take into account when we're projecting the impact of CO2 on climate and climate change.
Oh, good. Well, let's get to the topic of the day here. It's April the 22nd.
Yes.
2020, which means it's the 50th Earth Day. What exactly is Earth Day? What are we celebrating here? What can you tell us about when and how Earth Day got started and what we need to have foremost in our minds about it here now?
So that's some very interesting history. I did spent a little time the last week exploring the origins of Earth Day. But Earth Day is celebrated by roughly 1 billion people in 190 different nations around the world every year on April 22nd. So it's actually a big emphasis, especially to people who are concerned about environmental issues. And basically what Earth Day does is it's a time that's set aside to celebrate the Earth and to draw attention to concerns about the Earth, draw attention to our need to be caring for the Earth. So I like to say that we may celebrate Earth Day once a year, but God celebrates Earth Day every day. Because every day He is celebrating His creation, and His creation is celebrating Him. And every day He is concerned for its welfare and nurturing its longevity. So God celebrates Earth Day every day.
You distinguished earlier between ecology and environmentalism. Does Earth Day fit into one of those categories?
Earth Day would
better than
be
the other?
Aligned with environmental issues or environmentalism. Now, most ecologists, if not all, are environmentalists. But environmentalists and environmentalism is issue-oriented and issue-driven. Ecology are scientists who simply study how the world works. And so there is overlap, but they're not one and the same.
So people today, since environmentalism is issue-driven, people often see these environmental issues as partisan issues. Is Earth Day a Democrat or a Republican? Do we has this kind of partisanship always been part of Earth Day celebrations? Do you know?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And to answer that, let's go back a little bit. In fact, let's go back 50 years to the 1960s. So most of our listeners were not alive then. I was, although I was a kid. And many of our listeners may not realize, number one, that the 1960s was a decade that transformed a century. Think of everything else that was going on in the 60s. The Vietnam War, the civil rights demonstrations, rioting, etc. So it was a very tumultuous decade. In terms of the environment, a lot of our listeners may not know that it was really bad, worldwide as well as in the United States. Our rivers and lakes were being used as dumping grounds for raw sewage and chemical waste. The air, especially in urban areas, was very hazardous to health. It was very polluted. We were seeing oil spills and other environmental tragedies, dumping of mercury into ocean bays and stuff at a scale that we can't even comprehend today. Acid rain was a problem. Many of our iconic species were in demise, if not close to extinction, species like peregrine falcons and bald eagles. So there were some major environmental issues at the time. And interestingly, back then, environmental regulations and legislation was left up entirely to the states. And the states, therefore, had this disjointed, haphazard, ill-equipped approach to deal with problems that actually transcended state boundaries. Imagine that in the context of what we're experiencing today. So the federal government stepped in to quell that infighting. But what motivated the federal government to step in was Earth Day, the very first Earth Day on April 22nd, 1970. Now, they were doing some work before that, but Earth Day really propelled the government to become engaged. And that was largely driven by a governor from our own state who then became a national senator, Gaylord Nelson. He was passionate about the environment, and he was passionate about social issues. And the first Earth Day was his brainchild. It took him several years to be able to bring it to fruition. But get this, on April 22nd, 1970, 20 million people participated in Earth Day celebrations and demonstrations.
Nice.
Different schools, thousands of communities across the United States. And what that did is it succeeded in showing the political leaders that environmental issues should be addressed at the political level. So looking back now from this perspective of 50 years, we can understand why it was so successful. It was multi-generational. It was bipartisan. It had significant human and social justice components. It tapped into the idealism of youth and the energy of youth, and still it resonated with a broad swath of the American public. So, but one of the key things was it was bipartisan. 8 months after Earth Day, Nixon created the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And both parties passed a whole swath of environmental regulations in the early 70s. The Clean Air Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, the Endangered Species Act. Many acts that really helped to benefit the environment. And in fact, some of us would not be alive today if it were not for them. So very strong bipartisan support at a time when partisanship was really pretty strong. Perhaps not as strong as today, but the country was pretty divided in the late 60s, early 70s.
So trace that bipartisanship through these 50 years here now. What's the state of Earth Day celebrations now with respect to partisanship? Yeah,
well, the happy marriage between liberals and conservatives, especially back in the late 60s and early 70s, didn't last for long. Beginning in the 1980s, political progressives and conservatives began to diverge in terms of their interest and concern for environmental issues. Conservative leaders, this began especially under Reagan, but then was continued in others, began elevating particular ideologies above science. And one of the things about the early environmental legislation was that it put science above everything else, put science above political affiliation, political ideology. Well, that didn't last for long. And especially in the 80s, but you can see that this has continued to today, the value of science in addressing environmental issues has been subjugated, especially by the political right, to a number of other values or a number of ideologies. For example, a belief in American exceptionalism, that America is somehow different and exceptional from other countries. A deep and abiding faith in the economic market, and a faith that natural resources are abundant and will not run out. And then also another factor that came into play was a developing skepticism towards science. So all of those have kind of been have shaded and influenced, especially I think on the conservative right, attitudes toward environmental issues. And we can come back around to some of them that play out today a little bit later.
Asking whether your microphone might be a little bit covered up at the bottom of your phone.
Let's see. Yeah, a bit. All right,
I think it was just...
I'm going to have to do an adjustment here.
That sounds better though already in my ears. So
hold on. Okay, how is this? Is this better?
I got you really well now.
Okay, good.
So, talking about partisanship there and reactions to science and skepticism and all that, we have some of that going on right now too.
Yeah.
I wonder if you see any connections between the pandemic we're in at the moment and environmental crises.
Yeah.
Is there any kind of connection between that, maybe in the way the public reacts, but also even in the causes? Is there any kind of connection between our care of the environment or lack thereof and emerging infectious diseases and pandemics like COVID-19?
Yeah, there are a number of connections. Let's talk about maybe some of the ecological or biological connections first, and then come back around to how the pandemic has played out in ways that are similar to or perhaps different from environmental issues. So a COVID-19 is what we know as a zoonosis. It's a virus that inhabited wildlife that jumped to humans. So that's a zoonosis, a viral disease. And in this case, we think that it originated either in bats or maybe pangolins. Pangolins are these exotic-looking, kind of armor-plated, anteater-like organisms that live in Asia. Pangolins happen to be the most highly trafficked animal, wildlife trafficking, in the world. It's illegal to hunt and capture them, but they're trafficked all over the world and sold to restaurants and where people eat them, pay a lot of money to eat them. It's this type of illegal wildlife trafficking that brings people into contact with wildlife in a way that historically hasn't happened and contributes to jumping we've heard about the kind of wildlife markets or meat markets in China can contribute to the jumping of viruses from animals into humans. And we see that with a number of environmental issues. Malaria is resurging across the world, coupled to several things, but one of the things it's coupled to is climate change and warming and wetter environments. So as we move into the future, we'll see increasing evidence of and individual cases of emerging infectious diseases resulting because of threat multipliers like climate change or land degradation and wildlife trafficking. So there are some connections for sure between environmental issues and emerging diseases or even pandemics. You asked about parallels between the pandemic and environmental issues, and reflecting on that, I think there are a number of them. Interestingly, even though some people put a lot of faith in science, other people tend to be suspect of science, when we become caught in a really difficult place, like we are now with the COVID-19 epidemic, what do people turn to solve the problem? It's science. And that's the case with the pandemic. That is the case with other environmental issues, and will certainly be the case as we move into the future with issues like climate change. So science is got to be a bedrock of how we deal with some of these emerging and continuing crises. So that's one parallel. Another parallel is that the people who are impacted the most are those who live in poverty, those without access to medical care, and without access to other resources. That's true for pandemics, it's true now for climate change, and it's true for other environmental issues, pollution, for example. So that's the second parallel. A third is that this pandemic is showing the fragility of our food production system, our food production and distribution system. It's not as stable as I think we've all thought it is, and that's certainly a couple more, if I might. Another interesting parallel is the denialism. And the denialists about the pandemic are following the very same playbook as the denialists who are confronting climate change. So it starts out with, number one, it's not a problem. But after it becomes such a problem that can't be said anymore, then it's said, well, it's a problem, but it's not really that bad. And then the third is to blame it on somebody else, and oftentimes it's the Chinese, in both the case of climate change and this pandemic. And then a fourth commonality is a reliance on conspiracy theories to explain what's going on. And suspicion about the elite, whoever the elite are, but I think it includes scientists as well. So those are some parallels between the pandemic and...
Do you, as one of those elites, have any response to when people bring this up? I mean, part of it is social media, right? Our ability to even do this. I'm sure somewhere else on Instagram right now, somebody else is streaming to talk about how this virus came from a lab in China and how, how the 5G waves are propagating it throughout the world and all of these kinds of things. That this information is so readily available. Why are people supposed to believe these scientists instead of, or how? I mean, the answer to that's obvious, but how are we to sort through which of the many information sources we have available to us?
Yeah, right. That's a really good question. First of all, it has always cracked me up that people might think of me as part of the elite. If you knew how I lived, if you saw me drive, that's really pretty funny. But on the other hand, in all seriousness, I have access to things that the elite have access to. I mean, I have access to a good salary. I have access to good medical care and vast amounts of information because I'm a scientist and I work at a world-class.
You have a PhD. That qualifies as elitism, right?
Exactly. So it used to be that universities were the source and communicators of information. Well, universities and libraries were the gateways to information. That's no longer the case. Anybody who has a cell phone or a laptop has at their fingertips all the information that they can want. So more and more what universities should be doing and are doing is helping people to understand how do you sift through and ascertain what is true, what is not in this massive amount of information we have available. And so what I encourage people to do is to overtly identify who is your trusted truth authority. Who is it? Is it stuff you find on the internet? Is it your pastor? Is it your local scientist? I heard recently in this pandemic that scientists are among their friends and relatives known as nerd nodes of information. So I'm a nerd node. That's probably true.
That sounds less pretentious than an elite, right?
But what I encourage people to do is to not take the advice of individuals, because for every individual that is giving advice, you can find another individual who's giving counter advice. What I recommend people to do is this. Let's say your daughter or your son came down with leukemia. Where would you go to find information about the best cure for leukemia? You could Google it, and I'm sure you could find some herbal remedies or wire bracelets or arrange your furniture in some direction that is supposed to cure leukemia. If it were me, I would go to the National Institutes of Health because I view them as a trustworthy source of the best information, not perfect information, but the best information we have. So whether it is a medical issue or environmental issue, a pandemic, what I encourage people to do is to go to scientific societies and agencies that are known for producing peer-reviewed, published literature and have their hands on the best information. In a pandemic, that's the CDC and the NIH. I don't care what individual doctors are saying. Those are the people I trust. If it's something like climate change, see what the National Academy of Science is saying, or any of the World Meteorological Organization. So go to trusted agencies, trusted organizations for that.
And it's probably important for people to hear that those organizations are not infallible, but they certainly have a better track record over the long term of producing reliable information, right?
That's exactly right. They are not infallible. And some of the stuff that they're saying now is probably incorrect, but I would say it's the best information that we have access to.
Okay. Well, let's get back to Earth Day and maybe push into the faith side of it. BioLogos is a science and faith organization. You yourself are a Christian. What do we know about how the church has responded to Earth Day and environmental awareness that's been raised by Earth Day over these years?
Right. I would say the church writ large has had a rather schizophrenic response to Earth Day and environmental issues. The Bible of the Christian environmentalist movement was published just 10 years after the first Earth Day. It's called Earthkeeping, edited by Lauren Wilkinson, and that really engaged a lot of Christians and moved a number of denominations, individual Christians, churches, toward a better understanding of the importance of environmental issues, how it integrates with our faith, how it's a component of should be and is in fact a theological component of our faith. But that happened in a relatively small number among a small number of Christians, in my estimation. There's another category of Christians who have largely been uninterested, perhaps dismissive toward environmental issues. It's just not part of their world. So that's a second category. And then a third category is a small but vocal group that have been outright hostile, if not combative, toward environmental issues for a number of theological as well as political reasons.
In those second two groups you mentioned there, how do you, as an ecologist and as a Christian, how do you respond to those groups, those Christians who say that God gave us the earth for our own use, to exploit, to subdue, and that things like climate change are just overblown partisan hysteria?
Right. Yeah, and I confront that a fair amount. Early on, and even now, my first impulse would be to simply overwhelm them with scientific data. And it's obvious this is going on. But hopefully now I don't act on that impulse, because the fundamental issue here is not lack of information. It's conflicting worldviews. It's conflicting values. It's personal and tribal identity. And so, unfortunately, whether it's climate change or any other environmental issue, they're caught in this cultural divide. And it's really a divide of value systems. Environmental issues have typically been addressed from the liberal perspective of care and fairness, and they don't resonate as moral issues to conservatives. Conservatives rely more heavily on values of loyalty, authority, and sanctity. I'm borrowing here from, I know you know,
Jonathan Haidt. Yep.
Yeah, his work on moral frameworks. I think is very, very helpful in understanding the cultural divide that environmental issues are caught up in. And so conservatives have largely ceded that territory to the denialists and feel that these are actually not really moral issues after all. Whereas the liberals are continuing to pound away and say, well, wake up, they are moral issues, and they're just talking past each other. So in my efforts, I think the first thing we need to do is identify our own misperceptions, our own value systems, and where they might lead us astray. And then when I'm talking with somebody who's just saying it's not a problem or it's not that big of a problem, try to build trust with that person so they'll believe me, and then help them to come to understand that their views on particular issues are actually disconnected from their fundamental values, that there's a disconnect there. And to do that means that we need to, first of all, agree on some common values. And that's almost always possible. We all agree that we're interested in the welfare of our children. We all want a clean environment in which to recreate and into which to produce our food. And so finding some kind of common ground, common values that we share together, and then building on that to help them to understand that, well, actually this perspective you have about environmental issue A, B, or C doesn't really gel with your fundamental value of caring for people who live in poverty or caring for future generations. So I think that's the best approach. It's not easy, it's not fast, it's very slow, and it certainly doesn't always work.
So let's assume that for our audience here, we have built enough of that trust so that you can present some of these scientific information issues to us. What in your mind now are the top 3 environmental challenges that we're facing? What are those specific issues that we ought to know about?
For me, bar none, that the top most important, the existential crisis of our time, aside from this current pandemic, is climate change. We have already committed ourselves to moving into a climate trajectory that human civilization has never before experienced. So everything we know about civilization, our economies, our industries, our agriculture, our education systems, our economic systems grew up in a very stable climate system. And now we have left that behind, and there's going to be no going back in our lifetimes. Now,
so by that you mean even if today we stopped all further CO2 emissions, we're already on a path that these things are going to happen. What's going to happen? What are we talking about here?
That's exactly right. Because the climate change, so what is it? 9 of the 10 hottest years on record have occurred in the last 10 years. What's going to happen is this. First of all, it's important to understand that the climate change you're experiencing now is not a product of CO2 that we've emitted over the last 5 to 10 years. It's a product of CO2 that was emitted decades ago. And there is this very large and long lag time built into the climate system so that it takes decades, if not centuries, for the climate system to fully adapt to the CO2 that we've put into the air. So even if we entirely eliminate CO2 emissions today, we are dedicated to have climate change for at least another 100 years, if not several hundred. The Paris Climate Agreement set a goal of 2 degrees Celsius for the limit beyond which we cannot go if we're not going to suffer cataclysmic climate change. And they set an aspirational goal of 1.5 degrees C. Well, of that differential, we've already increased 1 degree. And we're locked into another half degree because of this lag effect in our system. So we've already hit the 1.5 aspirational goal. If we, and even that is going to produce a lot of hardship and a lot of difficulty. If we exceed the 2 degrees, which we're likely to do by around 2050, 2060, then we can expect some really serious consequences from increased flooding, increased droughts. A lot of scientific reports coming out this last week talking about a mega drought in the American West. increased problems with food production, and of course, all of these are going to impact those who live in poverty the worst. So that's just a small scenario, and one that, frankly, is very frightening to me.
There are some of our listeners here putting some questions in about these kinds of things. Can you tell us more? Somebody asks about threat multipliers. What is it about climate change that is a threat multiplier? What are those threats and how are they being multiplied by climate change?
Okay. I'm going to pause for just a second and go back because I just told you my first one. You asked for 3.
That was only the first of the, we'll get to some more of those in a little.
Okay. So threat multipliers, that's a really interesting concept. It's one that's used by the military. That is one factor that can amplify other factors. And climate change is a prime example, a wonderful example of a threat multiplier. In fact, many of the impacts of climate change that we will experience as people are not directly climate, but indirect because of a changing climate. So a threat multiplier in terms of climate change will increase civil strife and will increase wars. In fact, already wars in parts of the world, especially Africa, much of that has been attributed to changes in climate. So what a threat multiplier does is it's something that when it increases, it amplifies the negative impact of other factors with which it's associated.
Okay. So let's keep going here. A couple other environmental challenges we're facing today then.
Okay, and I'll be briefer with these. A second one is the loss of biological diversity. We've entered what scientists are calling the 6th major extinction event on Earth. The natural rate of extinction is somewhere around 1 to 5 species per year worldwide, and the current rate is 1,000 to 10,000 times.
Oof.
So we're losing a species on average about 1 per hour. And, a lot of these species are not species that even I know about, let alone the general public. But there is this very significant concern that ecosystems operate the way they do because of this rich source of biological diversity that is operating together. And as we keep removing those, at some point we're going to get ecosystem collapse.
So this isn't just a concern that certain species are going out of existence, and that's a sad thing in and of itself, but that there's a kind of pragmatic concern of what will that mean to these ecosystems.
Yes, exactly right.
Any examples of that come to mind that you could say here's a way that a loss of biodiversity has directly affected ecosystems?
I'll give you and here's a source of hope. When we can recreate systems or fix systems the way they used to be, all of a sudden they'll start operating better. So the story is more complex than I'm going to be able to explain here. But the Yellowstone ecosystem is a marvelous example of how loss of a single species completely changes the ecosystem. And in this case, we're talking about loss of wolves and other predatory animals. Since wolves have been reintroduced back into the Yellowstone area and over the last 20 years have multiplied, we've seen dramatic changes in the Yellowstone ecosystem. Who would think that wolves control the flow of groundwater?
How does that work?
Because what wolves do is they change the behavior, they change both the population densities and the behavior of their prey. So they're changing the behavior of elk, which are major mowers, browsers of vegetation. And because they're changing the behavior and the number of elk, the elk are afraid of the wolves. Now they're congregating more in open spaces and less in the thickets and stuff where they can be attacked. That's allowing beavers to reestablish in the Yellowstone ecosystem. And with beavers, that promotes the development of beaver ponds and the restructuring of water flow it's allowing the introduction of wolves has allowed willow thickets to return. And all of this is redirecting the channelization and the flow of water, which then is connected to the flow of underground water, because we put wolves back into the system. Now, I said the story is more complicated than that. There are other predators, cougars, grizzly bears that are also important. But that's just an example of how pulling one component out of a system can radically transform both the biological as well as the physical properties of that ecosystem.
And we've heard quite a bit the last year or a couple years maybe on insect biodiversity, and presumably the jobs that insects are doing are less visible to us perhaps than wolves are doing and their prey, but no less important for ecosystems, I'm guessing.
Oh yes, in fact way more important for ecosystems. So I wish I could show you pictures, but imagine walking through the produce section of your grocery store. If we were to remove all of the produce items that were pollinated by insects, a third to a half might remain. So insects are responsible for a vast amount of what we call ecosystem services. These are services that humans benefit from that are valued at the value of, I think, $124 trillion per year. And it's not all insects, but they contribute to a lot. They contribute to pest control. They contribute to pollination. They contribute to nutrient cycling in the soils. And so they're very, very important to ecosystem function. And there's number of insect species, as is true of bird species, as is true of amphibian species, are plummeting worldwide.
Okay. So I asked you top 3 environmental challenges. We have climate change. We have loss of biodiversity. Do you have one more for us?
Yeah, I'd say that my third one is all of the others.
Can you give us some highlights of that list, maybe?
There's so many others, and a lot that are important. But I would probably select food production coupled with land degradation. Another big issue. So I was, up until a few years ago, the research dean in one of the largest and arguably best colleges of agriculture in the world. And during the 6 years in which I was in deandom, I call it, I did a lot of traveling around the country, around the world. And one of the primary questions on the minds of agriculturalists worldwide is, how are we going to feed a population of 9.5 billion people with double the demand for food by the year 2050? And that is a vexing problem, especially in lieu of issues like climate change and mega droughts, etc. So, how are we going to feed the world's population and within coming decades is a really big issue. And how are we going to be able to do it in a sustainable fashion that doesn't continue to degrade vast areas of land throughout the world?
Here are a couple of other listener questions that have come in. You were talking about malaria earlier and climate change. Can we expect climate change to mean that we will probably see malaria spread to more areas than those that are common now? Will it make its way into Europe or North America?
I think so, yes. The vectors are mosquitoes, and they're spreading northward or into new habitats that are warmer and wetter than they had been. It's contentious. There is this figure thrown around in the public literature that malaria has been responsible for about half of the deaths of humans.
I saw that recently.
Yeah.
Over the whole history of human existence, half of the deaths are due to malaria.
Well, that's probably not true. It's probably far smaller than that. But the point is, malaria has been responsible for a vast number of deaths. And it's interesting, if you look around the world now in tropical areas where they have ancient cities, in many cases where those ancient cities are sited, such as in South America, they're sited at an elevation such that they're above the malaria zone. They're elevated higher, a higher altitude. With climate change, those climates are, and that malaria zone is increasing in altitude. So not only are they moving in terms of latitude, they're moving in terms of altitude, and that will certainly expose more people to the very negative impacts of malaria.
Another person's asking about the evidence for 2 degrees Celsius being a real threshold. What is that evidence? How certain are we that 2 degrees is really the breaking point that we must stay below?
Right. Yeah, very good question. 2 degrees was not scientifically determined and was not a product of the science world. It was a product of the political world. It was the number that politicians, representatives of various countries throughout the world were able to bring themselves to agree with, but significantly higher than what the scientific community wanted. So, yeah, how sure are we that that's a threshold? It's not like we're not going to drop off a cliff. These are gradual changes in terms of magnitude and in terms of the timeline. And so, it's not like we're going to be going along and then drop off a climate cliff. But we are already seeing very significant impacts of climate change. I mean, we're seeing in my own neighborhood floods like we've never seen before. And that's pretty much worldwide, and certainly more so at higher latitudes in Arctic and subarctic regions. So we're already seeing them. Another factor about climate change is with every half degree or degree increase, we don't see a linear increase in terms of the damage. We see an exponential increase. And people throughout the world, I hope you now understand what exponential increase means.
We've seen a lot of exponential growth curves lately, haven't we?
Yeah. And so, it's a multiplier again. So there's nothing special about 2 degrees. Most scientists that I read, the ones who are projecting into the future, very few of them think that we're going to be able to stay under that 2 degree differential. What the thinking is we're going to go beyond it, and then hopefully within decades we will have developed sufficient technology that can help us then to back up, to draw down CO2 out of the atmosphere and kind of to go backwards. But so we'll probably project beyond and then hopefully be able to throttle back. So nothing special about 2 degrees, but any increment is going to be amplifying.
Okay, we are winding down in our time here. Maybe let's, just in closing, look forward again on Earth Day. This is our 50th celebration. What about 50 years from now on the 100th Earth Day? What are we going to be facing? What steps can we take? What do you hope? I guess, what do you hope that the 100th celebration of Earth Day is like?
Yeah. I have to say that as a scientist, as an environmentalist, as an ecologist, I've carried with me for decades this kind of existential angst about the future. I just do. It's just part of me. I'm sorry, my kids who are listening to this. And so that's kind of has shaped who I am. On the other hand, if I thought that the world was without hope, if scientists thought that we were without hope, we'd just all pack our bags and go home. I mean, you have to have hope in order to continue to go to work day after day and to prepare a place that you think is going to be good for your kids and your grandkids. And I really like what St. Augustine said. in around, centuries ago about hope. And he wrote that hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. Anger to see things as they are, and courage to see that they don't remain as they are. And so when I think of hope, I think of those two components. Anger about how things are, and courage to work as hard as I can and to encourage others to work as hard as they can so that we can move toward a better world. So what do I hope for in another 50 years? I hope that my kids and my grandkids will be living in a world that is not committed to growth over sustainability. I hope that we've moved toward an economic system that is fully sustainable. I hope that we've learned to live more in harmony with our natural world. And I hope that the Christian community has grown in its appreciation of that very first command that God gave people, that is to care for, to nurture his earth. And so I hope that the Christian community, rather than being drawn kicking and screaming into environmental movement, might be taking the lead, leading the way in terms of caring for both the earth and its inhabitants. So those
Can you end by giving us a couple of practical things we might do in that regard? And practical things might have different time scales. Maybe a couple of things that we in the church especially can be working toward in the coming year or two to take better care of creation. But then maybe even one or two practical things that each of us individually might do even in the midst of coronavirus pandemic in the next week or two to better enjoy, learn of creation, take care of it.
Yeah. Let me take the last one first, and then you might have to bring me back around. We care about the things we love, and we love the things we are connected to. So I try not to lead with talking about creation care. I try to lead with talking about creation connection. Get people connected to the created world. So one of the things I'll say is get outside and enjoy the creation. Yes, I know we're supposed to be safer at home, but at least in my community, in my state, they still allow us to go outside for walks. And that's something I've been doing early in the morning and late in the afternoon. My wife and I will get out and go for walks and just appreciate the creation around us. Something that I've borrowed from my neurobiology colleagues is an emphasis, something I'll tell people, just rewire your brain. Just rewire your brain. Okay, well, what does that mean? It's a tool borrowed from neuroplasticity and mindfulness. Neurobiologists tell us that we can literally rewire our brains by the thoughts that we hold. And it's very simple and doesn't take much time. So here's something that everybody can do. Twice a day, step outside. Behold something in the world around us. A nice scene, a nice smell, sounds, and then hold that thought in your head. Hold it for 20 seconds. Think about it. Be mindful of it. Do that twice a day. And that will, over time, rewire your brain to be better connected to the world around us. And it's in being better connected, then we start to care about it, and we'll start to take care of it. So those are some practical, simple things we can do. At a larger scale, go online somewhere, fill out any of the online options available for determining your carbon footprint, and take some steps to reduce your carbon footprint.
Are there organizations in particular that you would encourage people to connect with or to follow in that regard?
BioLogos is
all right.
one. And
I guess that was a softball question for you.
Jim did not set me up for that, but certainly BioLogos. Evangelical Environmental Network has EEN, has lots of information. La Rocha, LAROCHA is another organization. All Christian organizations that have lots of information online. Young Evangelicals for Climate Change.
Good.
Another good group.
Well, super. Thanks so much for talking to us. To our listeners out there that are particularly interested in this topic, you can go to biologos.org and find some other of these resources. Rick has written a really nice piece for us, getting into some of the scientific details of this. And there are other articles on the website. And then on our BioLogos podcast called The Language of God, Rick was a guest back a couple of months ago. We've also had people like Catherine Hayhoe on as guests. Just last week, Brian McLaren, the Christian author, talked about his trip to the Galapagos Islands that had lots of environment and creation care things in it. Our episode that comes out tomorrow is devoted to understanding water better and the place that water plays in our ecosystem, both scientifically and as well as theologically. So check out all of those resources. I think that's it from us. Thanks again, Rick, so much for sharing your wisdom with us. And we trust and pray that Earth Day 50 years from now, we might have you back on as a guest again for this sort of thing.
That would be a miracle. But I'm looking forward to it. Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks so much. And thanks to all the listeners.
Yep.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.